onslaught from the skies were catastrophic. As well as strict military targets, the Allies pounded everything that could keep a war going. Power stations were a prime example. Government buildings were carefully picked out and wrecked, the results of the computerized precision targeting that the Allies employed to such remarkable effect. Baghdad suffered a blitz not seen since the last World War, though a strictly selective one. Communications were shattered. Not only was the Iraqis' military command and control structure knocked out, but the country's TV forced off the air as well. The civil population suffered badly. Fractured mains and sewers, compounded by heavy rainfall, had parts of Baghdad awash and prompted fears of disease. River bridges came down as part of the Allied campaign to shatter the infrastructure of what had been a modern state. There's no way of knowing exactly how many people died, for no matter how great the commitment to avoid such casualties, they did occur, as General Schwarzkopf prophesied. What the outside world saw of the damage done both to public and private buildings was strictly under the Iraqis' control. They maintained that the Allies were deliberately hitting civilian targets. The truth seems to be that stray bombs there were, but very few. What did happen was that people and property on the ground suffered a good deal from anti-aircraft fire which came down, and by incoming missiles destroyed in flight before they hit those carefully pre-programmed targets. Petrol dried up, ironic for a state which was one of the world's leading oil producers. But again, Allied bombing disrupted all aspects of life. Strangely, Western journalists who stayed in Baghdad reported little hostility from most ordinary Iraqis, no matter how bad things got. Night after night, as Baghdad was intensively bombed, people took refuge in underground shelters and bunkers. For the people of Iraq, there was little glory, much misery, in a country unable to defend itself against the mightiest military powers on the globe. Their president was assumed to be in his own deep and well-guarded bunker as he and his lieutenants struggled to command their military forces, most of them strung out in the desert under constant Allied bombardment. As the pressure on Iraq grew, so did the strain and danger facing those living in its cities and big towns. Although Saddam Hussein's support faded sharply after the war, during it there was much talk of loyalty, and there were sometimes signs of anger too.
This is not a game. Those are human lives. A human life. Enough of civilians.
A rocket fell there behind us and damaged our house, as you see.
President Saddam Hussein will stay here, and we will stay with him until the end of the war, and we will have our big victory here against America and other countries.
Then, on February the 13th, a bunker in the Baghdad suburb of Amaria was bombed, and inside it died some 300 civilians, many of them women and children. The Iraqis declared it was well known to be an air raid shelter. It was a disastrous moment. Much of the Muslim world expressed outrage. America insisted, however, that the place was doubling as a military command center. Officials produced much evidence to support their opinion. A little later, a stray RAF bomb was to kill many civilians in the town of Fallujah. That time there was no argument. An accident of the ghastly sort, all too common in war, had occurred.
We are not indiscriminately targeting civilian targets, and I think that the very action of the Iraqis themselves demonstrate that they know damn well that we're not attacking civilian targets. Since right now they've dispersed their airplanes into residential areas, they've moved their headquarters into schools, they've moved their headquarters into hotel buildings, they put guns and things like that on top of high-rise apartment buildings. Under the Geneva Convention, that gives us a perfect right to go after those things if we wanted to, and we haven't done it.
All through, Iraq kept up its attacks with Scud missiles, deliberately aiming for civilian areas of Saudi Arabia and Israel. Scuds were Russian-built but elderly and inaccurate. As they were fired from remote sites inside Iraq, people, as here in Riyadh, became adept at donning their gas masks and seeking shelter. Opposing the Scud's American Patriot missiles, which after a while proved pretty effective in bringing the Iraqi weapons down. The damage was not great. No military man rated the Scud a dangerous weapon, but their very unpredictability provoked fear. Not all were shot down, and some proved lethal. The result of that, a block of flats pulverized in the Saudi capital. The building was unoccupied, air raid procedures had worked well, so casualties were light. Battle of the Scuds over Israel. Again, the American Patriots were fired to try to blow up the incoming missiles. Many did come down, and many Israelis, particularly in Tel Aviv, were wounded, and quite a few died. Yet Israel was persuaded to hold its hand, not to retaliate. Despite the hardline reputation of its right-wing government, the country saw that the Allied coalition was wreaking all the destruction on Iraq that the country's bitterest enemies would wish, and the Patriots did a creditable job defending Israel's skies. Nevertheless, Jerusalem did say it would respond, one day and in its own way. The computerized Patriot anti-missile system was rushed into service from the factory in Massachusetts. It suited America to make tremendous efforts to keep Israel out of the war.
It's basically the computer will determine who's got the best capability of intercepting the missile, and the computer will go ahead and designate the unit to engage. I think Patriot is probably is definitely the king of air defense artillery right now, not only for the United States, but probably in all the free world.
Have you ever missed?
No, I have not.
Iraq had other targets in its sights. They used heavy artillery to destroy the oil refinery at Al-Khafji, a small town just over the Kuwaiti border in Saudi Arabia. A nondescript, deserted place, it was to have great significance a little later. The dense clouds of burning oil that resulted were a foretaste of things to come. All sorts of ecological horrors were forecast during the Gulf War. One soon came true. The Iraqis, having seized Kuwait's oil installations, hit back at the Allies by releasing masses of oil into the Gulf, producing the biggest slicks the world had ever seen. The disaster didn't end with wildlife. Saudi Arabia's population depends for fresh water on desalination plants built on the coastline of the Gulf, plants which would be badly damaged by the deadly tide of oil. The Allied side denounced the Iraqis for this attack on the environment and resolved to try to do something about it. As conservationists debated just how much long-term harm the oil spill would cause, Allied planes switched from their usual targets to bombing wellheads to cut off the oil flow. Success could be gauged by changes in the smoke colour. Once it went from black to grey, the menace was under control. Further out in the Gulf, the battleship Wisconsin used its 16-inch guns to assist the bombardment of Republican Guard units ashore.
16-inch is of course a great counter the other guy's firepower weapon. It's an anti-materiel weapon. And we prefer shooting at their artillery, at their structures. Don't waste the 16-inch on people. You can do that with other things.
Not a full-size plane, but an unmanned drone bringing back pictures of the effectiveness of the bombardment, aimed specially at the tanks hulls down in their U-shaped desert dugouts. British Jaguars, they too were now thrown into the offensive against the Republican Guard, switched from the attacks which had mostly destroyed Iraq's strategic defence systems. They carried cluster bombs to rain down the maximum damage on the troops identified as the principal obstacle left in the way of a ground offensive. As ground crews armed the planes, some personal messages were added to the onslaught. As the Americans stepped up the attack from the skies, B-52s, the most fearsome bombers the world's known, started hitting targets in Iraq and Kuwait, flying back and forth from the airbase at Fairford in Gloucestershire. Back in Kuwait, Iraqi forward positions capable of spotting Allied preparations were attacked by wave after wave of US Marine Harriers. Jaguar pilots returned to base with good reports of missions well accomplished.
We're going in there with good intelligence on what they've got and where, so it's helping us out an awful lot.
Because we've given a lot of thought and because we've played the tactics carefully, the Jaguars have had a very successful war and done very well.
The Allied commander explained why such heavy battering was required.
This is war. And the unfortunate part about warfare is that if you are not ferocious, your enemy is, and you take the casualties. And I don't want to see anybody die. But if somebody's going to die, if I have a choice, it's going to be the enemy before it's going to be my troops.
The land war, when it came, was swift and equally decisive. In 100 hours, fast-moving armoured columns routed all but one of the 42 divisions Iraq put in the field. The Allies tore to bits what the Iraqis had left out in the desert after the air onslaught. The Iraqis expected the Allies to attack across Kuwait's southern border, from the west, and above all from the sea, with the 4th US Marines Expeditionary Brigade, 18,000 men, mounting an amphibious landing. General Schwarzkopf did nothing to discourage that view. Britain's desert rats crisscrossed the desert like all the thousands of Allied fighting personnel assembled in the wastes of Saudi Arabia as they embarked on a grueling string of practice sessions, ensuring top-notch readiness for the moment when the signal for a ground campaign would be given. Sea King helicopters brought in supplies for soldiers who'd now endured many weeks of desert living. Their heavy artillery practiced the routines that would play their part in pulverizing the final shreds of Iraqi defense. A chemical alert, the reminder that this was potentially an exceptional sort of conflict. There had to be preparations for the possibility of chemical or biological attack. The Desert Rats trained because Iraq had shown itself more than willing to use such frightful weapons against its Iranian enemies during their 8-year war, and had used them against the Kurds in the north of Iraq. So, however cumbersome the gear, the coalition soldiers had to be ready. If the most feared sort of fighting did occur, getting casualties off the battlefield as quickly as possible would be essential. Into position went Rapier anti-aircraft missiles to protect the huge concentration of 10,000 British troops from any airstrikes Iraq might still attempt. Dumps for fuel and ammunition were dug, sealed, ready to keep vehicles running and gunners' demands satisfied as the battle rolled forward. There was more to all this preparation than met the eye and the ear. Part of the intention was to make as much noise and fuss as possible during this phase to make the Iraqi defenders of Kuwait think the Rats were actively preparing to fight in one place, the intention being to fight, actually, somewhere quite different. The sand was a constant problem for anything mechanical. There are 92 links in each tank track. They need individual attention. And when rolling from old to new, you'd better make it accurate, or you roll off into the sand and could spend a day being dug out. Dust didn't help the unglamorous but essential Hercules, here coming in to move gunners of the 2nd Field Regiment Royal Artillery to their real location on the battlefront. Of the 80,000 sorties flown during the war, half were transport operations like this one. And below, the miles and miles of convoys required to supply the offensive when it came. The shifting around of men and material was part of the great game of deception. And it was played to the full out in the waters of the Gulf. Naval forces from countries as far apart as Australia and South America took part. They carried out intensive supply and resupply operations and made great show of preparedness. The US carriers had already played an important role in the aerial bombardment of Iraq. Now they were poised to join in the ground war. On the deception side, though, the Okinawa, a US amphibious assault ship. From here were commanded the 18,000 men of the 4th Marines Expeditionary Brigade, the force that Schwarzkopf wanted the Iraqis to believe would lead the seaborne landings on Iraqi-held Kuwait. These are some of America's toughest troops, and they toiled away to be ready for the big day.
That we have a lot more firepower than they can imagine. We have our training is far superior than their training, and just our strong desire to liberate Kuwait is what's going to make the difference, and we will prevail.
But their big day never came. They weren't used. Iraq was misled into tying down vital troops along Kuwait's shoreline. The pretense was reinforced by the capture of two islands, al-Maradim and Qura. The occupiers were obviously ready to give up, and they were insignificant in the military sense, but enormously important psychologically. The Kuwaiti soldiers taking part kissed the soil of the first part of their homeland to be retaken. Artillery and other weapons were left loaded, never fired. Kuwait's flag was hoisted over territory seized back from the Iraqi invaders. A Saudi spy plane takes off to observe Iraqi troop concentrations as the countdown to all-out war went on. And troops on the front line fire a missile which will photograph those enemy positions, filling in more of the details to enable commanders to hit hardest where it'll most matter. After a few moments in the air, valuable pictures are ready to minimize miscalculations when the attack comes. Iraqi defences being probed in earnest by men of the 40th Heavy Regiment Royal Artillery and their self-propelled guns.
Go it! 279 female! 279 female! 279 female! 279 female! Bah!
US Marine spotters.
Every time we've been seeing people out there, we've been seeing them in at least groups of like 6 or 8 moving around.
They check the artilleryman's handiwork.
Probably 6.
The 40th Heavy got the message. Keep pounding. It was suggested Saddam Hussein, visiting his troops in Kuwait, may have narrowly escaped one such attack. He remained defiant, saying Iraq had weathered the best the Allies could do, promising that much Allied blood would be spilled. General Norman Schwarzkopf was scornful.
Okay, with regard to Saddam Hussein saying that he has met the best that the coalition has to offer, I would only say the best is yet to come. Thank you very much.
The completely unexpected happened on the Kuwaiti border when Iraqi forces massed at Al-Wafra and 2 battalions moved into Al-Khafji. As many as 3,000 Iraqis with tanks and armoured infantry vehicles just drove into the town one night, provoking the first land battle of the Gulf War. Normally, some 14,000 people lived here. But the Saudi border town, once a resort, had been deserted for 2 weeks. It was a fact Saddam Hussein could have found out by watching television. Iraqi movements were spotted by aerial reconnaissance and photographs hurriedly analysed. US Marines artillery was called in.
Roger out. It was about 40 minutes ago, sir, when they were requesting rules of engagement because they had a possible target.
The fire was directed onto Iraqi armour in the streets of Al-Khafji, a US Marine trapped in the town acting as spotter. Although such firepower was used unsparingly and to devastating effect, the actual job of retaking Al-Khafji would be left to Saudi and Qatari Arab forces. One US Marine defined the objective.
destroy them before they destroy us.
Hey, look here, we got two unidentified vehicles up there in the front, so keep an eye on what's going on.
Can you do this later, please?
Helicopter gunships were called in. These deadly Cobras, which had first seen service in Vietnam, roamed over the battlefield, playing a crucial role as the conflict unfolded. One target was this tower, being used by Iraqi snipers and artillery spotters. It was quickly neutralized. The helicopters also halted Iraqi attempts to reinforce their invaders with additional armour and mechanised infantry. F-16s and Marine Harriers took off to attack Iraqi armoured forces said to be massing behind the invading battalions. The Warthogs, the tank-busting Thunderbolts, were also thrown into the Allied counterattack. They claimed up to 41 Iraqi tanks and 19 other vehicles destroyed. One US pilot summed up the effectiveness of the Allied airstrike.
Well, I can say I certainly would not want to be an Iraqi troop up there. Aircraft are swarming over that battlefield like gnats. And like I said, I think my biggest danger up there today was running into another American aircraft delivering ordnance on target.
British Jaguar strike aircraft were also deployed. Some hit Iraqi land targets, others attacked 17 Iraqi missile ships supporting their land forces with rockets and troop reinforcements. 5 of the boats were sunk in the engagement, the other 12 were damaged. On the ground, US Marine spotters came under fire as they continued their task of locating Iraqi pockets of resistance 2 miles away in the town.